Thank you very much for the invitation, Simon. Thank you to the Western Front Association, and thank you to all of you for tuning in to listen to this talk. It's always a joy talking to the Western Front Association, and when I was preparing this talk, it gave me the chance to think about why I had got into the First World War. The First World War always fascinated me. Always interested in it. And I began to think when I was getting ready to talk to you, what it was that really interested me about this conflict above all. And I think it was partly the family connection, as with many of you. It's partly hearing about the stories of what an awful war this was, but also mingled in with that horror, admiration for the resilience of the people caught up in it on all sides. That was what my first book was about. If you think about the Western Front, which of course were the stories that I heard, and you think about the names of the battles that the British fought: First Ypres, Second Ypres, Loos, the Somme, Arras, Passchendaele. It's like a litany of suffering. But then there's another reason as well why 1914, why the First World War interests me, and it's 1914, because 1914 is different. Unlike the grinding war of attrition that comes in once stasis sets in on the Western Front in November 1914, the summer and that autumn of 1914 is a world of possibilities. It's a time of opportunities. And it's not just me who thinks that. Of course, that's what the contemporary general staffs on all sides thought as well. And of course, in Britain, we all know about what was happening on the Western Front, about the so-called Schlieffen Plan, Germany's operational plan to beat the French. What about on the East? There, the Russians were on the attack, and the Russians had an enormous superiority, far greater than anything the Germans had in the West. There are huge clashes there, massive, bloody clashes in places which we're less familiar with, and with names that are difficult to pronounce. And the subject of this webinar is one of those places, a place called Przemyśl, a fortress city. Today, Przemyśl is in the southeastern corner of Poland. It's just on the border with Ukraine. But in 1914, Przemyśl was the main bastion in the east of the Habsburg Empire, an extraordinary state. It was, with 50 million population, it was more populous than Britain. At the time, it covered lands which today encompass modern Austria, modern Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, parts of Serbia, parts of Italy, parts of Poland, parts of Ukraine. This was a state with 11 official languages. And the fortress city of Przemyśl, as the Habsburg Empire's main defensive bastion in the East, played a key part, a crucial part, through most of the first year of the First World War. It was the scene of the longest siege of the First World War, lasting 181 days. What I'm going to focus on in this webinar, though, is Przemyśl's role in the opening stages of the war, in that key time of possibilities in the summer and the autumn of 1914. And I'm going to tell the extraordinary story of how, during that autumn of 1914, when the Russians invaded with overwhelming force, this obsolete fortress, and by 1914 it was obsolete, and its extraordinary multi-ethnic garrison of middle-aged reservists saved the Habsburg Empire from immediate defeat. So I'm going to switch over, and after that I'm going to switch over to share screen. And the Eastern Front is always best told with pictures. So let's Let's go. Europe of 1914 was very much a continent at war. In the West, of course, the Germans were attacking France through Belgium. France was also attempting to invade Germany further to the south. Attempts in August 1914 to break into Alsace-Lorraine. The Austro-Hungarians are trying very unsuccessfully to invade Serbia. And most importantly for our purposes, and maybe most importantly actually full stop, debatable, the Russians are on the attack in the east. The Russians have the most powerful army in the world in 1914, some 3.4 million soldiers at first mobilization. And in August 1914, they put into operation what they call Plan 19, which is an offensive operational plan to begin the invasion of Central Europe. Now, if you take a look at the map, what you'll see is contemporary Russia, or it's better to refer to as the Russian Empire, in 1914, had a kind of a salient jutting into Central Europe, surrounded by German and Austro-Hungarian territory, German territory in the north and Austro-Hungarian territory in the south. And Plan 19 was designed to, its key objectives were to eliminate those two flanks, which was crucial if the Russians were going to advance further westwards. The operation that everybody knows about is the Russian invasion of East Prussia in the north, German territory, which famously ends at the Battle of Tannenberg at the end of August. By mid-September, the Russians have been chased out of German territory. That's a key victory for the Germans. It's crucially important. It's not quite as important as everybody thinks. The Russians are actually back in East Prussia. They invade again in November, but nonetheless, it's very, very significant. For the Russians, though, the major theatre of 1914 is not East Prussia. The major theatre is the theatre to the south, Galicia. This is the place where they put most of their forces. To invade Galicia, they deploy more than 3 times the number of men, some 53 divisions by the end of August 1914, than they deploy in East Prussia. East Prussia is something of a sideshow compared to Galicia. Galicia is important for a second reason too. It's important because it's a more decisive theatre. The chances of beating the German army decisively in East Prussia are nil, was mostly because most of the German armies, of course, fighting in the west. By contrast, the bulk of the Habsburg army is deployed in Galicia in August 1914, and a decisive victory here could actually mean an early end to the war. Tied to that as well, if the Russians win in Galicia, it opens up way more possibilities if you look at the map than a victory in East Prussia does. It allows them to push westwards into Germany, into the southeastern province of Germany, Upper Silesia, which is a key industrial area of Germany, crucial for any longer war effort. And it also allows the Russians, should they so desire, to push south instead into Hungary. So Galicia is crucially important because it does offer the possibilities, unlike East Prussia, of a decisive victory, which will genuinely shorten the war. There's also a third reason why the Russians have Galicia as their main operational target, and that's ideological. Today, this is an area which is in southern Poland and western Ukraine. And the Russians at this time, and Putin has used the term as well, even more recently, believed that Ukrainians weren't a separate people, a separate nation. They referred to them as little Russians. That's the term Putin has since used as well. And the Russian state, the Tsar, was determined to take over and annex eastern Galicia, so the eastern half of this province that I've highlighted in red. More than that, the Russians very quickly develop frighteningly modern plans of ethnic cleansing. local Polish conservatives run this population, and the Russians want to remove them from power. They want to turn Ukrainians in this area into Russian through religious and language conversion. And also the Russian army is horrendously anti-Semitic. The initial invasion is accompanied by pogroms, attacks on the local Jewish population of Galicia. The population is around 8 million, around half Poles, half Ukrainian speakers, and around 800,000 Jews. And the Jews in particular are targeted by the invading Russian armies. And during the occupation in 1915, around 50,000 to 100,000, the numbers are mixed, but are moved eastward in the province and also forcibly moved into Russia. There's actually ethnic cleansing going on already in early 1915. We see whole Jewish populations moved. Bear in mind, of course, what I'm talking about here is Britain's ally. Yeah, this is what the Russians, Britain's ally, are doing. And had Britain and France triumphed in the West and Russia in the East in 1914, a very, very dark future would have awaited Central Europe. That's worth thinking about when we're thinking about the European dimension of the First World War. An Allied victory is not necessarily a good victory in the sense of democracy, of liberalism, of people's rights, of better living standards for peoples. The Russian regime was a really nasty autocratic regime, and a racist one as well. Przemyśl was right in the middle of Galicia. And Przemyśl had always been a fortress in a way. The earliest references to it, dating back 1,000 years, are words of war. They talk about how warring kingdoms were fighting over the stronghold of Przemyśl. But it was also a crossroad of cultures, as indeed was the whole region. It was, there were around 50,000 people that lived there in 1914. Around half the population, just under, were Polish. Around a third were Jewish, and about a fifth were Ukrainians. It's a very, very mixed population, and they lived in harmony. Broadly, there was anti-Semitism, there was competition between Poles and Ukrainians, but broadly this was a multinational community that operated pretty successfully. The story of Przemyśl as the Habsburg Empire's main bastion in the east kind of starts a bit in the 1950s during the Crimean War, when the Habsburgs first began putting up earthworks. But the major history of the city as a modern fortress begins in the 1870s. When the Habsburg General Staff and the Emperor Franz Joseph were looking to secure Galicia, and indeed the whole east of the empire, against an increasingly hostile Russia. And they chose Przemyśl for a number of reasons. The first was that defending Galicia along the borders was difficult. The border was around 500 miles long, 750 kilometers, and it wasn't easily defensible. And along much of it, there weren't rivers. It was flat. It wasn't really possible to defend it along the borders. And Przemyśl offered a nice central site from which, if there was an invasion, a Habsburg army could sally out in whichever direction was necessary to defend the province. The second reason why Przemyśl was chosen was that it was defensible. It lies in the foothills of the Carpathians. If you look just to the south of Przemyśl, the map gets kind of knobbly, and those are the Carpathian Mountains, a huge mountain range separating today Poland from Slovakia, at that time Galicia from Habsburg Hungary. And those get lower and lower. Przemyśl lies in the foothills. It's the last highland before the Russian border. Additionally, as well, Przemyśl was seen as advantageous because, firstly, it controlled the passes, the main passes, the Dukla and the Łupków passes into Hungary through these mountains. And also, and most importantly, it controlled the key east-west railway running through Galicia. And of course, as you'll all know, railways were crucially important for early 20th century armies. Without having control of the railways, 20th century armies could not move forward. And Przemyśl controlled both the East-West Railway through Galicia, and it also controlled the railway south into Hungary as well. So it was a transport node, and it was a key point, a key defensive point, which controlled these crucial rail and road links. The fortress had been built from the late 1870s onwards, and over the 1880s and 1890s, most of the fortress had been built. And it's worth saying a few words about what a 19th century fortress looked like. Because it wasn't like a medieval castle, it was much, much more complicated than that, and much larger as well. The fortress of Przemyśl consisted of two defensive rings and an inner ring of fortifications, mainly earthworks, which by 1914 really didn't make any difference to anybody, they didn't matter. And much more importantly, an outer set of fortifications, a fortified ring, a rough ellipse, which was around 48 kilometers, 30 miles in circumference. And on this 48 kilometers ring were, by 1914, 37 permanent forts. Worth also mentioning that it's not simply the hard outer crust of those concrete brick and stone forts which comprise the fortress. The city itself was a key part of this. The city contained barracks, it contained the Central Fortress Command. The army, once it started building in Przemyśl, built roads, built bridges, built telegraph and telephone lines in order to connect up this ring with the centre. Even the population was in some ways part of the fortress. In a siege, part of the population was expected to stay in order to supply the needs of the garrison. Unfortunately for the builders of Przemyśl, artillery technology developed very, very quickly at the end of the 19th century. Huge amounts of money was spent on Przemyśl, but ultimately by 1900 it was obsolete. The first innovations are new explosive powders for shells. Steel shells are invented in the 1880s and 1890s. Then later on, around 1900, there's a universal adoption of recoilless artillery. And so in the 20 years between 1880, when the first forts begin to be built, and 1900, 1910, technology moves massively quickly and the forts become obsolete. I've got an example up on the screen, Fort 1, Salissoglio, known to the garrison as Aunt Sally. This was built between 1882 and 1886, and it gives you a sense of what the typical early forts in Przemyśl were like. As you can see, it's a rough trapezium. It's got a moat all around it. It was designed to hold out for 2 weeks. It had ammunition magazines. It had food magazines. It had its own sick quarters. It had both artillery and infantry. There were the garrison was around 400 plus 7 officers and a doctor and a commander, and it had its guns mounted unprotected, largely on the top of the fortress, certainly unprotected to the sort of shrapnel burst that guns were capable of putting down by 1914. It had these mounted, as you can see, on the roof of the fort. The infantry positions are just in front of the ditch. You can see that, and they were to be used as a last ditch defence, literally. Excuse the pun. By 1914, forts like this are a sitting duck. Also, the armament is obsolete. Around a third of the guns in the fortress, had around 1,000 artillery pieces, and around a third date from 1861. They fire black powder, they range about 3 kilometers. Modern field artillery, Russian field artillery, has a range about double that. The fact that the guns are black powder doesn't usually matter because, of course, the entire fort is a sitting duck. Through the 1890s, the Habsburg High Command General Staff attempts to upgrade the forts of Przemyśl. It's always cash-strapped, it's always short of money, but it does build new forts to higher levels of specification with more concrete, with steel armoured couplers. But by 1906, a new Chief General Staff, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, comes in. He has no faith in fortresses. He realised Przemyśl is obsolete and he terminates the funding. And for that last decade before the First World War, Przemyśl gets minimal funds allocated to it. And as I've said, as a result, its defences are outmoded. To understand how Przemyśl comes to play such a central role at the start of the First World War, we need to begin with a Habsburg catastrophe. In August 1914, Galicia was invaded. The Russians placed 53 divisions divided into 4 armies, the 4th, 5th, 3rd and the 8th, against central Galicia and to the east. The Russians were led by this man, the Tsar's uncle, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, known in the Romanov family, the Imperial Russian family, as the terrible uncle, with good cause. He had a horrendous sense. He had a horrendous temper. Conrad, who is the chief of the Habsburg General Staff, counters by placing the bulk of his army in Galicia. And as you can see, facing these 4 Russian armies were 3 Habsburg ones, the 1st, the 4th, and the 3rd, moving from west to east, as well as the so-called Army Group Corvis. Now, army groups in the Habsburg designation were actually smaller than main armies. It's not that there are a number of armies in this. It's a small formation of a couple of divisions, I think. Roughly, the Habsburg dispositions give Conrad parity in the north against the 4th and the 5th armies. There's about the same number of troops on either side. But in the east, with the 3rd Army and Army Group Corvis, these 2 formations have just half the troops that the Russian 3rd and the Russian 8th armies have. Number of reasons for that. One is that the Habsburg army was far smaller than the Russians. The Russian army, as I've said, at full mobilization strength was 3.4 million men. Massive. No one could match that. Not even the Germans. And of course, there were millions of troops as well further to the rear as reserves waiting to come up. The Habsburg army at full mobilization, by contrast, didn't quite meet 1.7 million. And around 1.2 million were deployed in Galicia. The rest were deployed in the southeastern front in Serbia. So the Habsburg army is simply smaller. It's smaller because of a lack of funding, which means it doesn't recruit the same proportion of men, even as the Russians do with a much smaller, with the Habsburg Empire having a much smaller population. Second reason for why the Habsburg is so short of men is Conrad's own bungling. He sends some of the troops in the wrong direction at the start of the war. He's desperate to fight Serbia, and he's hoping for a quick victory over Serbia. And he sends 12 divisions down south to Serbia. And then when the emperor and the minister president of Hungary intervene and say, "What are you doing? The Russians are going to invade us." He then sends these troops, most of them, not all of them, some of them end up delayed against Serbia, back up to Galicia. So they perform this huge 2 sides of a triangle journey, which means many of them are delayed. And that's why you have Army Group Corvis rather than a full army in the east. Another point at which Conrad bungles is the dispositions of the troops themselves. The general mobilization plan had been stolen before the First World War broke out. This is realized, it's stolen by an intelligence officer called Colonel Alfred Riedel. This is realized, and so Conrad changed the dispositions. And at first, the plan is to unload the troops in the middle of Galicia along river lines and have them for defense. But just after the war breaks out, or as the war is breaking out, Conrad changes his mind. He decides that actually it's better to have the troops attack. So he orders his railway staff to change the dispositions, but they say, sorry, too late. And as a result, all of these troops are unloaded in the middle of the province. And then they have to march tens of kilometers to the borders, to the new jump-off points. So by the time they actually get into battle, they've already marched tens of miles, sometimes 80 or 90 kilometers, 50, 60 miles, and they're exhausted. And the first battles go very, very, very badly for the Habsburgs. The First and Fourth Army admittedly do okay. They attack northwest, and on the 26th of August, and then a few days later, they have victories at Krasnik and Komarov, which two places in Russian-ruled Poland. Well, they're attacking north, however, and these victories don't go anywhere. They're not in any way decisive. The Russian troops in the east, with double the manpower of the Third Army and Army Group Kurvis, invade eastern Galicia, and they very quickly push the Third Army back. The Habsburgs lose huge casualties in this. The Habsburg army was short of artillery, again partly due to funding, largely due to funding restrictions. And Conrad tried to compensate for this by emphasizing that energetic infantry don't need artillery, it's our land that's the key, they can go forward without support. Of course, this ends in a bloodbath. The Third Army goes reeling back. On the 3rd of September, the provincial capital Lemberg, today the West Ukrainian city Lviv, is captured by the Russians. Conrad tries to retrieve the situation, but on the 11th of September, he has to order a general retreat. And the Habsburg army is pushed all the way back to the San River, back, in other words, to Przemyśl. There's no way it can stop at this point, and it goes even further back, another 140 kilometers to two other rivers, the Duniets and the Biała rivers in Galicia, and those blue arrows show that. If you'd been here, looking eastwards, as this picture does, this is a picture of Przemyśl looking eastwards, if you've been on that bell tower in the middle of the picture, looking eastwards, surveying those hills and the main road to Lemberg eastwards, on the 14th of September, what you would have seen coming through would have been a broken army. It was a horrific sight. You would have seen military transport pulled by exhausted horses with drivers fast asleep, spanning the entire road, 4 wagons next to each other, slowly moving forward. Sometimes one would fall in a ditch, the entire column would stop, there would be cursing, soldiers would come and haul it out. Intermixed with these transports would be the remains of broken regiments with exhausted men who'd spent the last weeks in horror, continually awake, in action, and these regiments were devastated. They were decimated, and you would have seen this site right along the road as far as you could see to Lemberg, and you would have seen those sites as well on every road, in the north, in the east, and even in the southeast of Przemyśl. In the countryside outside the roads, you would have seen stragglers, ragged Habsburg soldiers who dropped their kit, dumped their rifles, and deserted their regiments in the hope of getting to safety, making their way cross-country, trying desperately to escape the huge Russian forces. that were coming eastward. This was an army which was devoid of discipline, which had lost a third of its manpower. It had gone in with around 900,000 combat troops. In those first three weeks of war, it loses 350,000 killed, wounded, or captured. And it was an army where discipline was failing. Conrad had to get it back. He had to get a breathing space in order to refill its ranks, in order to restore its discipline, in order to restore hope for the soldiers. And on the 16th of September, just as he's ordering the field army to retreat further back, he issues Order 2096 to the Przemyśl fortress garrison, which says that the fortress of Przemyśl is for now to hold by itself at all costs. Soon followed. The first sight of Russian troops was Cossacks, light cavalry, which appeared, which fortress observers saw on the 17th of September, the day that the Habsburg Field Army begins moving further back, 140 kilometers to the west. These are soon followed by infantry. On the 23rd of September, the north of the fortress is blockaded, and on the 24th, the last road west is cut. An ammunition column, so a set of Habsburg troops from the garrison, sent 45 kilometers westward to get ammunition to bring it back to the fortress, manages to reach its destination, but then can't get back. Russian cavalry cut the road and block it off. And from that point, the fortress is surrounded. There's some debate in the Russian High Command and among Russian generals about what to do. Stavka, the Russian High Command, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich and his closest advisors don't want to take any chances. They want to win the fortress, simply ring it round with troops, block the garrison in, maybe starve it out. And keep it under check while they move most of their troops northwards into central Poland for what they hope will be a decisive, deep penetration of Germany. That's what the High Command wants to do, what Grand Duke Nikolai wants to do. But on the 1st of October, the man who's put in charge of the area around Przemyśl, the three armies around it, the Russian Third Army, the Eighth Army, and a new blockade army, the 11th Army, is a man you've probably heard of, General Alexei Brusilov. The Russian general, of course, came to fame in 1916 with his infamous victory over the Habsburg army. And Brusilov is energetic, he's keen, and he recognizes that for Russia's prospects of winning this war quickly and decisively, it is crucial to capture Przemyśl. Przemyśl can't be allowed to delay the Russian armies. It can't be allowed to give the Habsburg Field Army the breathing space that it so desperately needs to reconstitute. Brusilov sees it as key, and he sees it as key above all because it controls the transport links. And if he can get Przemyśl quickly, he can get those railway links, and he can shuffle the Third and the Eighth Armies very quickly forward with the munitions, with the supplies that they need, and and attack Krakow. Additionally, as well, having that key east-west railway through Galicia will help supply the armies in the north, attempting to make this deep penetration into Germany. So Brusilov rightly sees Przemyśl is a key to winning a decisive victory in this war, to invading Germany, and also, hopefully, to inflicting that final defeat that the tottering Habsburg army, that will cause the tottering Habsburg army to collapse. The man in charge of the blockading army is Lieutenant General Dmitry Szczerbachev. And he comes up with a plan. The Russians have around Przemyśl somewhat more than 100,000 troops. Originally, they just have the blockade army consists of 5 reserve divisions, but Brusilov strengthens it considerably. He adds another reserve division. He adds 2 elite active divisions full of the youngest, best trained men that the Russian army has, as well as heavy artillery. or at least medium artillery. And he tells Shcherbakov that this will be enough to go forward and beat the fortress. The weakness of the Russian army is artillery. The Russians have the strongest artillery that the Russians have, or the heaviest artillery is these pieces that I've got up on the screen. They have 23 15.2 centimeter Schneider Kreuzer howitzers. So 15 centimeter howitzers are the biggest calibers they've got. Other powers, the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans, had invested in much larger calibers. The Austro-Hungarians invested in a 30 centimeter gun. The Germans invest in a 420 millimeter, 42 centimeter gun, Krupp howitzer. Before the First World War, the Russians don't have anything that big. And these howitzers don't have the explosive power necessary to break Przemyśl's fortresses. The commanders aren't sure about that, but they recognise it's a risk. Overall, only 1 in every 8 Russian gun is a heavy gun. They've mainly got light artillery. But nonetheless, both Brusilov and Shcherbakov are pretty confident. The Russian intelligence reports call the defences rightly as antique. These are defences, they say, that belong to the realm of history, quote unquote. So Shcherbakov and Brusilov are confident that they can beat the fortress and beat it quickly. Now, of course, to all us armchair military historians, all of you and I know that it's not, in the end, in any battle, the defences or the weaponry that determine the outcome. It's the men that are decisive. But unfortunately, in the case of Przemyśl, the men gave the Russians huge confidence that they were going to be able to take Przemyśl fortress very quickly. The garrison was large. It consisted of 180,000 soldiers, and they were led by this man that I've got up on the screen, the fortress commander, Lieutenant General Hermann von Kuzmanek. Kuzmanek, like all, or nearly all Habsburg commanders, and unlike the Russians, who of course had fought the Japanese just 10 years before, had no combat experience whatsoever. He joined the army in 1879. He was the son of a policeman. He'd never heard guns fire. He was a bureaucrat. He spent quite a lot of time in working in the Habsburg War Ministry. And for a fortress commander, that was actually quite a valuable experience to have, because the fortress commander had to mediate between civilian authorities and military authorities. So he was an effective bureaucrat, largely, although even then, not always. One of the mistakes made as the fortress is about to be surrounded is, by accident, the fortress's entire supply of petrol is accidentally evacuated by rail. This is just days before before the encirclement starts, with the Russians already looming. And of course, there's frantic telegraphing to get these tankers back, and they managed to do it just hours before the final railway into Przemyśl is blown at lunchtime on the 19th of September. So, you know, to say he was competent, well, that was a question mark. The troops underneath him were mostly very low-grade troops. The Habsburg army, like most continental armies at this time, divided its troops according to age, and these were the oldest reservists. They consisted of so-called Landsturm brigades, which were units filled with men aged between 37 and 42 years old, middle-aged men. This was literally a dad's army. They were extraordinarily multi-ethnic. They came from Galicia, so Poles, Ukrainians, Jews. There was a Landsturm brigade from northern Hungary with Hungarians, Slovaks, Germans, and Jews in it. There was an Austrian brigade as well, with German speakers and Italians in it. It was very much, Przemyśl, like the rest of the Habsburg army, was a Babel. And that's what I was extraordinarily interesting, how it manages and often fails to manage, especially in the context of war, once officers start to die and be wounded. The many languages that these units operate in. As well as being multi-ethnic, as I've said, the garrison was old. It was very poorly equipped. These Landsturm units didn't have much artillery. Each brigade had around 8 to 9,000 men in it, backed by 10 field guns, very low number. They didn't have any machine guns. They didn't have any signals. They had hardly any. They didn't have any transport, and they had hardly any medical provision as well. And the reason why these men whose training was decades in the past were put in as fortress garrison was that Conrad never expected they would be used. And if they were used, he was thought they simply wouldn't be able to survive maneuver warfare. So that was why they were put in to garrison Przemyśl. And as well as age and multi-ethnicity, perhaps their biggest characteristic was risk aversion, which I'm 41, and that I think comes with age too. These were men who, as I've said, had families, and men with families are generally very reluctant to take vain risks. A trench newspaper, a comic epic story, which was written by one of these soldiers for the garrison's delight later on in the siege. It was called A Saga of Heroism. Described these Landsturm units as these men from Landsturm regiment whom these men who in Landsturm regiment their service gave, in brackets, which everyone knows is very brave, whenever in the forward line would hope and pray to God divine, the enemy would not appear on their horizon, far or near. And that very much encapsulated the military ethos of these units. They could be brave. Later months would show that they had an extraordinary capacity for sustaining suffering, extraordinary resilience, but nonetheless they were soldiers who were more likely to be found at the bottom of the trench praying rather than going over the top. Now, the Russian plan to take the fortress at the start of October 1914 was to launch a three-pronged attack. This is the Russian blockade line in red that I've got around it. You can see the names of the units. And Szczerbakov planned to launch an attack, a diversionary attack in the north with the 78th Reserve, the 82nd Reserve, and the 12th Infantry Regiment. There was also going to be and that was to divert the garrison, to attract the fortress's reserves up to the north. In the south, a flank attack by this 3rd Rifle Brigade, but the major attack was to be in the southeast. And the reason why, well, there were a number of very good reasons why Szczerbakov chose the southeast. The weakest side of the fortress defences was in the west, but no offensive was possible there because it wasn't near any rail lines. It would be very difficult to supply any attacking force. Launching a major attack in the north was unattractive because that was the strongest face of the fortress, and in the south, that was also not a terribly attractive front to launch because even if the fortress line was broken, just behind it ran another line of hills, which the Habsburg garrison would be able to set up a kind of improvised but strong defensive position. The southeast, by contrast, was great for the Russians. There were hills overlooking it outside the fortress ring, so they had great artillery observation. They could attack it from two sides. It was near rail connections, so the attack force could be very easily supplied. And also because this was going to be an infantry-led attack. The artillery was comparatively weak, so it was going to be the infantry that would crack the fortress ring. The southeast was attractive as well because there were forests, there were gullies, there were ruined villages which supplied cover for the infantry, up to between 1 and 2 kilometers from the fortress perimeter. And it's this part, this Fort 1 you can see in the southeast, and the auxiliary forts around it, Fort 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, and 1, 6, which were the key break-in point for the Russians. The Russians were under huge pressure. They had to capture the fortress quickly. They didn't want to give time for the Habsburg army to recover. And already there was intelligence that the Habsburg army was recovering. For Kuzminek, on the other side, he was in a terrible situation. He had his fortress was obsolete, his garrison was mostly unfit, the nearest Habsburg troops were 70 kilometers away. But he did have one bit of hope, which was that Conrad had sent an aeroplane with a staff officer at the start of August with the important news that the fortress, with the important news that the field army was on the verge of offensive. It had just about recovered, and it would come forward to relieve the fortress if the fortress could just hang on and give it that extra time. At first, of course, for Kuzminek and the garrison, as they watch the encirclement go around them, it's not clear whether they are whether the Russians are going to attack at all. On the 3rd, they see Russian troops actually leaving the north of the perimeter, and there's hope that maybe they won't. But on the night of the 4th to 5th, first the fortress's north front, and then the northeast, and then the southeast and the south begin to report that Russian troops are approaching. And it becomes clear that the Russians are going to attempt to storm the fortress. The 5th of October is the first day, and on the first day, the Russians aim to take out the advanced positions beyond the fortress ring, and they do that extremely successfully. The fortress's standing orders, the garrison's standing orders, are that the garrison's mission, they say, is to hold the fortress so long as possible. That, from beginning to end, is the guiding consideration. But by the evening of the 5th, by the end of that first day, Kuzminek must have doubted whether the fortress was going to hold at all, because all of the forward defences on hills outside the fortress ring fall to Russian troops. The Russian troops proved themselves very, very skilled. I think it's often unrecognised just how much the Russians had benefited from their experience in the Japanese experience of defeat, but experience nonetheless in the Japanese war. Training for the Russian attackers was recognised that firepower was key, and that coordinating artillery and firepower was crucially important if troops were going to get forward. And with the light artillery firing over their heads, Russian troops move in very sophisticated ways. They move quickly in small groups, and then they dig in. And other troops come up to the fortification, come up to the entrenchments that the assault troops have attacked, and then they move forward and repeat the process. So it's a rhythm of run, dig, run, dig, run, dig, run, dig. You don't see this on the Western Front in August 1914 or September, although they quickly adapt. But the Russians begin to do this very, very quickly. They really learn the lessons of firepower from the Japanese war. And the little garrisons on these hills outside the ring simply collapse. Kuzminek begins to worry, and he sees the attack coming on the in the southeast. The Russians have problems. The northern attack force, despite the fact it's meant to be diversionary, isn't ready, and it doesn't go forward on this day. Right, so it doesn't fill its purpose. So Kuzminek is already beginning to, by the end of the day, to funnel troops to the decisive southeast, and by the end of the following day, by the end of the 6th, he's doubled the troops there from 13 infantry battalions to 25, and he's also put a lot more. He's also put a lot more artillery, strengthening it. On the 6th of October, the second day, that's a day of bombardment. Shabaka is desperate to attack, but the commander of the 19th Division in this decisive area says, no, we're not doing it. The artillery need to break down the forts. If we go forward with the forts' artillery still intact, we will suffer horrendous casualties. And a couple of units do try that, on the second day of the attack, and that's exactly what happens. So the second day becomes a day of bombardment, a day in which shells whine over. And what we find is across the 4 days, from the 5th to the 8th of October, this takes place, the Russians shoot 45,000 shells into the fortress defences. Now, of course, by later standards, by the standards of the West, this isn't so much the storm of steel as an explosive drizzle. This really isn't anything compared with what is later fired on the Somme or at Verdun or in the German spring offensive of March 1918. But what you've got to remember is that this is the start of the war, and these middle-aged soldiers have seen nothing like this whatsoever. Physically, the bombardment doesn't do any damage or barely any damage at all. The forts withstand it very, very well. But psychologically, it is catastrophic. Men talk about not being able to withstand the roar of the guns. And of course, being in a fort as well, sheltering under a bombardment, although you were well protected, you were also very claustrophobic. The flight or fight instinct that we all naturally had was retarded. There was nothing men could do. And it was extraordinarily stressful. I'll give you an example from one of the soldiers, the memoir of one of the soldiers who went through this in Fort 1, that Aunt Sally, the fort that I showed you earlier in the presentation. He was sheltering on this day in that Aunt Sally, in that Fort 1. This is how he described it. He said, "First quietly, in the far distance begins the shrill whistle, which quickly swells to a piercing howl. And then the shell thuds like a colossal battering ram furiously against the earth covering of the old fort. The building resounds and shudders down to its foundations. The blast rushes powerfully through the cold, dark corridors. Dust and gases from the explosion forcing their way in make the air heavy and suffocating. Sand trickles through the old walls. Stones, turf, clods of earth patter down like a thunder shower into the courtyard. The impact of the first shot is still reverberating when already a shrill whistle announces the approach of a second. Involuntarily, each man bows his head, tenses muscles and nerves." And that was for the entire day. By the evening, the fortress garrison is suffering a state of morale shock. There are nervous disorders. There are defeatist rumors that the Russians are about to break into the city, and this is a quote from time, and then make goulash out of the inhabitants. I think probably from a Hungarian soldier in the fortress. There's a real sense that morale is wobbling. While the buildings are firm, the men are beginning to panic. And you see these examples of drawings from this comic epic story that I mentioned, and the troops, these Landstrom troops, knew they weren't heroic. A lot of the humour during the blockade is very much of an ironic black humour, which kind of reflects the timidity of these older soldiers. By the end of that day, Sherbakov has to go forward. He now has concrete information that the Habsburg Field Army is at last moving, and it's moving quickly. Most of the Russian troops that had been in Galicia had been moved forward for the Russian High Command's decisive attack into Germany further to the north. So Sherbakov and Brusilov, going to capture the forts, have to do it now. There's no possibility of delaying any further, fort guns intact or not. And on that evening, at 8:45 that evening, Sherbakov orders a general attack on the fortress from all three sides. And all three sides begin to move forward. The attack is due as a night attack at 2 a.m. The troops go off at 2 a.m. in the north and attack, and they've got the furthest to go because, as I've said, the northern contingent has been delayed. It wasn't ready, and it wasn't ready, and it wasn't ready. It doesn't move on the 5th, it doesn't move on the 6th, but on the 7th of October, this decisive day, they do go forward, and they get within 70 meters of the glacis of some of the forts in the north. In the south too, the troops go forward, but they're delayed. The order that there's a problem. The order doesn't come through until just after dawn, so they go through in broad daylight, and it's an active, if you like, a regular, standing brigade that does that. And despite the fact that they're going in daylight, they do well and get very close to the large fort number 4 that they're attacking, but they aren't able to break in either. But for Shcherbakov and Brusilov, their eyes are on the southeast, because that is going to be where the attack succeeds, or where there's going to be disaster. And the key point of that attack is here, this fort, Fort 11 Wysychka. Nowhere else do the Russians come so close to winning. And I'm going to finish up by just quickly telling you the story of what happens here, because it's telling on a number of levels. The Habsburg army after the battle made a huge thing about this. They built up a myth around it. The commander was this man in the on the top right of the screen, a Croatian regular officer, Jankošvili Juga. The fort was, unlike most of those at Przemyśl, a modern fort with armoured couplers on the left-hand side and strong concrete. So it was a real example of pioneering Habsburg military technology. And the garrison in it was drawn from all parts of the empire, from both sides. The artillerymen, the 46 artillerymen in it, were Austrians from Vienna, from the metropolitan capital of the empire, and the infantry were Hungarian and Slovakian peasants, drawn from the north of Hungary. And there was this big story built up about how, under military leadership, this battle showed that the empire could come together and win the war. Of course, the true story was very, very different. It wasn't Lieutenant Jankošvili Juga who was the fortress commander. It was, in fact, this man below him, Lieutenant Istvan Bielek, who was a reserve officer. He was a Landsturm officer. He was 39 years old in October 1914, and 2 months before civilization had collapsed, he had been a Budapest lawyer. His garrison was, his unit was the Hungarian 11th Landsturm Regiment, formed from Slovaks, Hungarians, and Jews in the north of Hungary. And it's clear from the documentation that these men didn't get on with the Austrians that they were with. One reason for that was, of course, language. The Austrian, they couldn't easily communicate with the Austrian gunners. The Habsburg command used German mostly as its language of command, but of course for the men they didn't necessarily know very much of that. Second problem was age. The Austrian fortress gunners, the Viennese fortress gunners, were from a regular regiment, so they were younger men. These infantry were old, middle-aged men. And of course, the layout of the fort emphasized that as well. The artillerymen were positioned in this casemate over on the top left, whereas the infantry were positioned in the main fort. So they operated largely separately, and during the battle, they pretty much, the artillery and the infantry in this fort, about 130, 140 men in total, led very much, they fought separate battles to a great degree. On the night of 6th, 7th of October, the garrison was exhausted. They'd been under fire all day. The men were tired. Their searchlight, which they used to eliminate the forward areas, had been knocked out by Russian artillery fire. But nonetheless, the sentries felt secure because they knew that there was a listening post in front of them. Around 3 a.m., however, they begin to get worried. It's not quite clear why. One possibility is that one story is that noises, working parties have been out working on the wire, fixing it, and they continued to go on even when the working parties came back. So that may have caused suspicion. The other story is that some of the listening post, one man in the listening post at the front, out in the front of the fort, managed to get off a warning shot before his throat was cut from Russians, regular soldiers of infantry regiment 73, Crimean Infantry Regiment 73, stealthily approaching the fortress. But at 3 a.m., for whatever reason, the sentries on the infantry wall get nervous. They call up Bielik, and he orders flares to be fired. And when they fire those flares, they see to their horror that already there are Russian troops at the bottom of the Fort Glacis. At that moment, seeing their men have been discovered, the Russians switch on this very powerful searchlight directly into the face of the garrison. That comes from Russian lines behind, and they also set down a massive bombardment. The sensory experience must have been overwhelming, of deafening and blinding these Landster men on the fort wall. And the Russian troops at the bottom of the glacis rush forward and desperately start cutting the wire in order to get close to that ditch which they need to cross. A firefight develops, and this goes on for 2 hours. One of the 2 machine guns on the fort wall is knocked out. The Russians get closer and closer. The Russians don't have very much equipment. They've each regiment has been given 8 scaling ladders, 8 steel cables, 18 8-meter long bridges, 65 wire cutters, and laughably, of course, this is very early, 32 hand grenades. And accompanying the infantry are sappers with gun cotton. Of course, they know that the artillery can't destroy the forts, so the idea is these sappers will place the gun cotton down the chimneys around the doors, and they will blow open the fort. At 5 a.m., the Russians launch their final assault, and they cross the ditch. They manage to lay a bridge across the ditch, and they storm across it. All this time, the fort's guns haven't been firing, and Bielik is screaming orders to his men, and also screaming down into the depths of the fort, asking why the Austrian artillery aren't shooting. There are a couple of stories about why. The artillery, of course, insists. Well, the artillery don't say anything about this after. But one possibility is that the Russians are coming on the right of the fort. The guns are on the left, so it's difficult for them to get a target. But the story that the Hungarians tell is that Széll, who is the senior artillery officer in the fort, had a nervous breakdown, and he's sitting in the middle of the fort, rocking backwards and forwards with his head in his hands and crossing himself, going, "Oh my God, oh my God." And no other artillery officer, there's one artillery officer and an ensign besides Széll in the fort, is willing to take over command without Széll's order. And that's why the fort guns don't fire. The Russians break across the ditch, and when they lay the ditch and start coming across, finally the ensign realizes that all will be lost if he doesn't, and he swivels one of the turrets around and fires canister shot, very short range shot, right across the infantry wall of the fort, and that's probably what knocks the bridge down. Bielik and his men attempt to fight the Russians, but there's too many of them. There's about 250 on the wall by this point, and Bielik orders retreat into the fort. At that point, just at that point, he's wounded by an artillery blast. His men pick him up. They hammer on the iron door of the fort, which has already been shut. It opens. They bring him in. Fort is closed, and the iron door is shut again. All of the Hungarian infantry on the wall that have been able to disengage have, and they are now trapped in the fort. There's no way of getting out. They're surrounded by Russians. There's no way of communicating either. The telephone lines have been broken. The telephone telegraph lines have broken. No way of getting a runaround. The Russians are in total control. And they've done the difficult bit, and this is astounding. They have dodged minefields. They've cut through wire. They've got through that death trap ditch, 3 meters in depth. 150 dead Russians and 70 heavily wounded were found at the end of the battle there. But they got over. They are in control of the top of the fort, but they can't get in. The gun cotton that their sappers have brought with them has got damp on the journey over, and when they drop it down the chimneys, it simply fizzles. It doesn't explode. So they're trapped on the fort, and there's no way of getting in. They interrogate Hungarian wounded. They try and charge the doors, but there's no way that they can. So you end up with this very strange standoff where the Hungarian infantry are artillery are trapped, cowering inside the wall, inside the fort, with the cries of wounded echoing through it, terrified about the Russians getting in, and the Russians on the outside of the fort, total control, but unable to break through. So the Russians set up a machine gun facing to the rear of the fort, and they build barricades, and they set them on fire, and they wait to see what will happen next. 7:30 a.m. finally, a relief force of Hungarian troops comes from the left and the right, and they make short work of the Russians. They take out the machine gun on top of the fort, and they are about to charge the flaming barricades when, unhelpfully, both sides' artillery opens fire. The Habsburg artillery opens fire, well, the Russian artillery opens fire because it sees the relief coming and it's trying to repel it, and the Habsburg artillery open fire because they see the Russian troops and they believe the fort is already in Russian control. At that point, the Russians realize that they're up. The 2 officers commanding them commit suicide. They shoot themselves, and everybody else, Hungarians and Russians alike, the Russians panic, and everybody drops drops fighting. They're both endangered by this heavy bombardment kind of, and everybody begins hammering on the door, demanding entry. It takes a long time for the Habsburg garrison inside the fortress to do that. Of course, they can't see what's going on. They've only got very narrow embrasures plugged with sandbags. The walls are very thick, but there's a lot of swearing, and both Hungarian and Russian have wonderful swear words, and eventually they remove the thick wooden beams and they let in both the Hungarian relief force and 150 Russian prisoners. And with that, Fort 11 is relieved. And that is the closest the Russians come to capturing a fort and to taking the fortress reign. Other attacks on other parts of the southeast fail on the 7th, and on the 8th it's recognised, and this is the relief. And on the 8th, it's recognised. Shabakov recognises that the Habsburg Field Army is on its way. They have to withdraw, and on the 8th, Russian troops begin to disengage. And on the night of the 8th and 9th, they disappear. And when the fortress defenders wake up on the 9th of October, they've gone. At midday, the first troops, a cavalry patrol from the Habsburg Field Army, trot down and arrive in the west of the fortress. So, what can we conclude from all this? Well, the struggle of Przemyśl, the endurance of the troops, shows a number of things. The first is that the very fact that the fortress was there in the middle of Galicia, one crucial time for the Habsburg Field Army. At one time, of course, because the Russians needed to lap around it, and that took that wasted valuable time. It gave the Habsburg army the chance to retreat that 140 kilometers, to refill its ranks, to reorder its men, to restore discipline, and to become, once again, a fighting force. In addition, the fortress pinned over 100,000 Russian troops, which otherwise would have been wending their way quickly westwards in order to eliminate the Habsburg Field Army. And most importantly, the fortress offered a constant active threat to the rear of Russians. to the Russians. And the possession of that, by controlling that east-west railway, it denied Brusilov the opportunity to get up more men, to get up the munitions, the supplies that his troops would need to keep marching westwards and invade Krakow and support the what the Russians hoped would be the decisive attack into Germany further north. For all its obsolescence, for all the underinvestment of the pre-war years, Przemyśl served its function. And also, so too did its old garrison. And I think there's a message for all of us in our 40s and beyond there, that even middle-aged people can achieve remarkable things. Together, the defences of Fortress Przemyśl and that middle-aged multi-ethnic garrison gave the field army space to recover and to restore discipline. And as a result, they saved it, and more broadly, the Habsburg Empire from defeat in 1914. Now, of course, that isn't the end of Przemyśl's ordeal. In November, the Russians once again encircle the fortress city. There's a longer, the siege is resumed, there's a longer encirclement, and we see the beginnings of total war. We see one of the first aerial bombardments of a civilian population. We see a strategy of starvation enacted, and we also see ethnic cleansing as well pursued by the Russians. Particularly ominous, of course, when we think about what happens in exactly this area 20 years later. The precursors are already there in 1914 with the Imperial Russian Army. And that continuation of the siege brought immense suffering. It brought huge destruction. The fortress itself ended up demolished and destroyed by the end of the siege, and the city of Przemyśl was occupied by the Russians in March 1915, with devastating consequences for its Polish, Ukrainian, and above all for its Jewish population. But that is another story, and if you want to know more, if you want to pursue that story, then I've written a book on this, The Fortress, The Great Siege of Przemyśl. Do take a look at it, and thank you very, very much for your attention, and I'd love to hear what questions you've got.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Alex. Very, very interesting. As I said in the introduction, probably not an area that I would have pursued 6 months ago, but learned a lot tonight. So thank you very much. Could I ask the attendees to, by way of thank you, just to raise your hands, please. So I don't know if you can see it, Alex, but all the hands are going up. Hundreds of hands are going up now by way of applause. So thank you. So could I invite any questions, please, for Alex? We've already had a few coming in. What I'm going to do tonight is read them out rather than trying to bring up videos of the questioners. We've already had one technical catastrophe with not being able to stream it into Facebook. And again, apologies for that. So I'm going to go to the questions now. Right, the very first question that came in was from Peter Newnham, who asks Alex, could you say Przemyśl slowly, please? He wants to know what the definitive pronunciation is.
So for the definitive pronunciation, I'd recommend you go to the English version of Wikipedia, which actually I think has a recording of how you say it. But it said Przemyśl. So just a hint of it now, Przemyśl. Is the Polish for it. The Ukrainians, of course, many of these places have different names in different languages because they were, before the Second World War, they were very multi-ethnic places. In Ukrainian, it's known as Przemyśl, but in Polish, it's Przemyśl. Yeah, and I see another one from Alan Atkinson as well. Ludendorff, while still a colonel, had reconnoitred the Belgian forts before the war. To what extent had the Russians studied the construction and armament of the Przemyśl forts pre-war? The Russians had the plans for the Przemyśl fortress ring, which was one reason why Brusilov and Sherbakov were so confident that they could take it. The Habsburg army before the war was riddled with Russian spies, with espionage. Colonel Alfred Redl was only the most famous of them, and either he or somebody else had given the Russians the detailed plans of the fort ring. going. So they had a very good idea of what they faced.
Okay. Trevor Adams asks, what languages did you have to deal with to do this work?
So the Habsburg Army consisted of three major parts. It consisted of the so-called Common Army, which recruited men from both the Austrian and Hungarian sides of the empire, and then it had two other parts, the so-called Landwehr, which was recruited just from the Austrian side, and the Honved, which was recruited just from the Hungarian side. Just bear with me. The Common Army and the Landwehr both use German as their language of command. So all regiments will use German as their language of command, but officers are expected to know the languages of their men as well. And you have what's called a system of the regimental language. So a regimental language is any language spoken by a fifth of the men or more. So many regiments have two or even three languages. Some even have four languages. The formation recruited only from the Hungarian side, the Honved, and also Hungarian Landsturm units, the old guys. They used Hungarian as their language of command. So in order to do this research, I needed German, which most of the military documents are in. And I needed Polish, because I also look at the civilian population. Of course, the civilians, as I said near the start of my presentation, are part of this complex. They're a key part of the fortress. So I speak German and Polish, and those are the languages I used. In addition, I also needed Hungarian, so I had a translator translate Hungarian for me, and I also needed Ukrainian as well in order to take in that part of the population. The Austro-Hungarian command translated a lot of Russian documents into German, so I used those as well, and my Ukrainian translator was able to read Russian, so that helped me with that as well. So German, Polish, Hungarian, Ukrainian, and Russian were the languages on which this book is based. Lemberg wasn't a fortress city, no. The two fortresses in Galicia were permanent fortresses anyway, were Przemyśl, which is the strongest one, and Krakow, further to the west, about 200 kilometers further to the west. Lemberg, or Lvov, as the Poles called it, or Lviv, as the Ukrainians called it, didn't have any permanent fortifications. The Habsburg High Command did, as an emergency measure, try and claim that it was a fortress city right at the start of 1914, and some earthworks were hurriedly thrown up around it. And when the Russians approached, the guns were evacuated, and then Conrad said, no, we need to fight here, so they were put back. But the defenses were too weak, and there was no fighting at Lemberg itself. It wasn't forced. Are there any remains of the fort to be? You're very welcome, Alan. Are there any remains of the fort still to be seen? Yes, there are, and I thoroughly recommend you go and take a look. The fort ruins are really, really impressive and really, really moving. I finished with them in my book as a sort of memorial, as sort of fitting memorial for all that followed. I see 1914 as the start of East Central Europe is the most bloodied, most awful, awfully ravaged part of Europe, of the world in the first half of the 20th century. It sees all the horrors: huge violence, massive armies, totalitarian dictatorships, ethnic cleansing, genocide. And I see 1914 and what the Russians begin, and to a lesser extent the Habsburgs, as the start of this racism, these modern programs. And to me, the ruins of the fortress are a very fitting memorial for all the rubble that eventually came out of the violence that was launched in 1914.
It's worth pointing out, sorry, Alex, worth pointing out, whilst we can't travel easily at the moment, that there are films on YouTube of people going around the ruins of the fortifications. So anybody wanting to see them.
they're really interesting. And if any of you do decide to go, then by all means, drop me a line. I can put you in touch with some of the right people, or give you pointers on whom to contact. There's a professional guide office for which organises guides, local guides, enthusiastic and very knowledgeable local historians who will take you around the forts. And that was one of the things I did at the outset of the project. It was really important to get a sense of what this city was like, what the forts were like. So I went around the circuit and looked at some of the forts to get a sense. And yeah, I thoroughly recommend it. I've got another question here. When did Russia develop Plan 19? Did their allies know it? I think it was originally developed from 1910, and originally it was conceived as a defensive operation, but it developed in the subsequent years as the Russian army got stronger. The Russians invest a huge proportion of the state income on their military. It's really the pride of the state. And yes, the Russians did know about it. And one of the reasons why it develops into an offensive, sorry, the Allies did know about it. And one of the reasons why it develops into an offensive scheme is that the French are pushing the Russians not to stay on the defensive, but to launch an attack quickly, because the French know that they are likely to face the bulk of the German army. Were the building plans to Fort Douaumont, similar to Fort Douaumont at Verdun? No. Douaumont was way, way, way more modern, even than Fort 11. It was bigger fort, and it was much, much more modern, far more advanced. Where else have we got? How is the siege commemorated today, if at all? If I miss it any, son, will you tell me?
I will. Yeah, no, absolutely.
It is commemorated. There's, I mean, above all, there's a really active local historical society which produces publications. The archive and the society, the local archive and the society, they both have their own journals. They produce really quality stuff. The most knowledgeable people about the most knowledgeable person about the technical aspects of the fort is a local, Thomas Szyszkowski, who drew some of the drawings that I've shown you. There are some reenactors as well. But I guess it's also commemorated at a family level too. I guess in a way that a lot of you guys commemorate your what your grandfathers, great grandfathers, maybe fathers in some cases did in the First World War. So too, you know, families. There are a lot of the population. The population has very much changed. As I said, it was very multi-ethnic in 1914. The Jews who lived in the city were wiped out in the Holocaust. The Ukrainians were then deported by the communist Polish government in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, and Poles who were forced out of what is now Western Ukraine were installed there. So there are a lot of people there whose families stretch back to other areas further east. But there are also a lot of Polish families who do have descendants, sorry, who do have ancestors who have lived for a long time in Przemyśl, and the family stories they tell are amazing. And there's a lot of memoirs as well published by these families, which is great because you actually get a sense of who these people were. The families are able to give extra information. One of the things I do in my book is to try and show what happened to some of these civilians ripped out of their lives and put into this awful catastrophic war, and try and show how that war changed them and changed their prospects and changed their lives, very frequently for the worse, in the decades after. And I can do that because of the local commemoration. Why did Russians not build a link line to connect the railways they controlled? Ultimately, they did. During the second siege, which lasted from November to March 1915, they did build a railway around the fortress, but they didn't have the time in the autumn of 1914. Of course, the summer, autumn of 1914 is about manoeuvre. It's about a fast victory. Everyone is aiming for that decisive victory. So this is not a time to build railways. This is a time to thrust, to move forward, to attack, to assault. And that's what the Russians are trying to do. What have we got? I've got two here. Are you planning more books on Austro-Hungarian war efforts in World War I? And without sounding too much of a fan, don't worry about that. Sound as much of a fan as you want. That's fine. Really. I thoroughly enjoyed this book and the one on the German Austro-Hungarian High Command. What's your next project? So I'm not planning another book on the Austro-Hungarians in the First World War. That doesn't mean that I won't write one. I'm 41. I've got, I hope, quite a lot of books left of me, touch wood. I've written 3 books on the First World War now, some of which you can see behind my shoulder, and there's another one as well, Enduring the Great War, on the Western Front. It can be really depressing writing about this stuff. Obviously, you know, I mean, I really try and talk about the men, the experiences, what it was like to be there in this book, and I do that too with Ring of Steel and with my other book, Enduring the Great War. I get a lot of sympathy for the people that I write about. And I think for now I want a bit of a break from the First World War. I've also said everything that I really wanted to say on it at the moment with 3 books. And I think what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to write a book about Germany's last election in 1932, November 1932, the election, the last election before Hitler gets in, and what that was like. I think that might be quite an exciting book to write and something a bit different from what I've done before. But thank you for asking. What happened to Hermann Kusenek? So Hermann Kusenek von Berg-Neustadt, the Austro-Hungarian officers, 3 things about them. Firstly, the training is lousy, they're disorganized, they're not generally very effective fighters. On the plus side, however, they are amazing linguists. Conrad, for example, spoke 7 languages fluently, and they're just extraordinary, the languages they can master. Puts our monolingual society to shame. That's one plus side. The other point is they have the best names of any officers in any army ever. Hermann Kusenek von Berg-Neustadt, and who can beat that? After the October victory, and in fairness, you know, he played a key part. He did identify the Southeast as the right as the right one to go for, the right place to put his reserves. He was promoted. He then stays through the fortress through its when the siege is resumed from November 1914 through to the capitulation in March 1915. There's huge amounts of corruption, huge amounts of disorganization, especially among the officer classes in Przemyśl, in this awful second siege in which the city is starved out, and Kusenek doesn't take control of that in any way, and he becomes a very ineffectual leader. He's not very good at motivating the men either. Officers complain that the men simply don't see him in the siege, and eventually he's when the fortress falls in March 1915, he's taken into captivity, and he spends most of the rest of the war till I think 1917 in a place called Nizhny Novgorod, which is, I think, you'll have to check the map. I think it's not so far away from Moscow, I think. And he suffers the humiliation of being the most senior Habsburg officer to be captured during the First World War. After the war, there's all sorts of rumours that he didn't adequately prepare the fortress for the second siege, especially in terms of stockpiling food, and there was a lot of truth in that too. An investigation is launched into his actions in the aftermath of the war, and that clears him. It's arguably a bit of a whitewash. Those rumours about he didn't do enough to bring food into the fortress they persist. They persist through the war and into the aftermath. With so many of
the last ones.
Sorry,
I'm just saying a couple of final questions.
Okay. With so many ethnicities, what provisions were made for holding religious ceremonies, or were they placed on hold for the whole of the siege? No, they weren't. The Habsburg army was linguistically, as I've talked about, very, very, very diverse. But one of the ways that it attempted to unite these people, and as I said, that the empire itself had 11 official languages, and there were more that were not recognized too. One of the ways the Habsburg Empire attempted to unite people was through religion. something like 4/5 of the population was Catholic. So Habsburg divisions, for example, have far more military chaplains than German divisions do. They really place a great emphasis on making sure religious provisions are met. And that's true not just of Catholics, both Roman Catholics and Greek Catholics. It's also true of Protestants, and it's also true of having rabbis for Jews, and also imams, because there are Muslim troops from Bosnia fighting in the Austro-Hungarian army as well, some of the best troops. No, there are services held right through the siege in all confessions and beliefs. How would you travel there? Fly to Krakow. The best place to fly to is a place called Rzeszów, spelt R-Z-E. Hold on. Yeah, R-Z-E-S-Z-O-W. Rzeszów is the nearest airport. That's the best way to get there. The other way you can do it is fly to Lviv in Ukraine and then go across the border. But that's the border is a really, really big, full-on border. And if you go by coach, you can be waiting there for hours. I've done it both by coach and walking. Walking is pretty quick, but yeah, I prefer to Rzeszów. That'd be my advice. If you decide to go when all this pandemic is over, as hopefully it will be, and you want a bit of advice, as I said, very happy to drop you a line. Drop me a line. Very happy to give you some advice. Why didn't the Russians just surround the fort and not attack and send the rest of the armies to chase the Hungarian and prevent them from regrouping? Well, they do that in November. That's the second. They do that from November, and they put low-grade troops there in November. They don't do it in the summer because, well, two reasons. The High Command actually suggests doing that, but Brusilov persuades them that it would be the wrong decision. And it would be the wrong decision, firstly, because it would pin 100,000 troops around Przemyśl when they are needed for going forwards. And secondly, because in the summer and autumn of 1914, the war is one of mobility. It's one of maneuver. It's one, as I started off the presentation by saying, it's one of possibilities, of the opportunity for decisive victory. That's how Brusilov sees it. And as a result, for him, with the Habsburg Field Army teetering, with it clear that it's been defeated, it's lost a third of its effectives, it's lost discipline, it's lost hope, getting forward, pushing it and toppling it, for the Russians, that's the key. And for Brusilov, this is the chance of a lifetime, and he's desperate to take it. And that's why they storm the fortress.
Okay, thank you. That's the end of the questions. So could I ask people to, again, show their appreciation by raising their hands?
Can I say one more thing as well? But if that would be...
Please.
All right. Well, the first is, and this was long, and thank you very much for listening. It's a huge pleasure to tell the story. It's always a huge pleasure to talk to the Western Front Association. And the second thing I want to say is that if any of you school teachers, my department at Goldsmiths University of London is running some history webinars for A-level students, including on the First World War and Weimar Republic and a range of other topics. If you or your students would like to take part in that, do drop me a line and I'll send you the events booking. I'm very happy to do that, just in case there's any school teachers out there. But thank you very much for listening. It's always a huge pleasure to talk to you, and I'm very excited about this story. So, if you want to know more, take a look at the book.
Alex, thank you very much indeed. I'll drop you an email tomorrow, just pick up one or two loose ends. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Again, apologies that it didn't go out to Facebook, but just one of those things, I'm afraid. But it will appear on the Western Front Association YouTube channel probably within the next couple of weeks, hopefully. And as ever, there's more webinars coming up on Monday nights. The next one is from Tim Cook of the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, talking about the secret history of soldiers and how the Canadian soldiers coped on the Great War battlefield as told through their letters, diaries and memoirs. So that should be another good one. So that's it. Thanks again to Alex. I'll speak to you tomorrow, and to everybody else, thank you and good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous.